guys, today we're going to be talking about the context, plot, and themes of The Hate Race and Charlie's Country. Let's go. We'll start off by looking at the context and plot of each text. Maxine Beneba Clark's seminal novel, The Hate Race, follows the childhood and adolescence of its author, who is the main protagonist. The book is a memoir, meaning that it is based around a recollection of her life and filtered through her psyche and experiences. The book begins with Clark's family, British citizens of Afro-Caribbean descent, moving to Sydney, New South Wales. They settle in the town of Kellyville, which is known as a white picket community. Although these communities largely don't exist anymore, they were once described as suburban environments where only Anglo-Australians live. As you can probably imagine, this immediately caused problems for Clark's family, with suspicion from neighbours and racist interactions with other kids in the neighbourhood. Clark initially focuses on her experiences in kindergarten, revealing how prejudice and discrimination can be inculcated, meaning taught to, in children even from such a tender age. Clark meets her first tormentor, Kalita Allen. Kalita makes every effort to exclude Clark from participating in usual preschool activities, hurling insults across playgrounds and calling her dirty. Literally, of course, Kalita is referring to Clark's black skin color, but metaphorically, it reflects the deeply hateful implication that anyone with a dark complexion is inherently inferior and lesser than white Australians. The bullying doesn't stop by the time Clark reaches primary school. In fact, it intensifies, aided and abetted by teachers who constantly turn a blind eye to the constant, gut-wrenching racial abuse. One of the most salient, meaning important, scenes arises when Clark is asked by a teacher what her parents do for a living. Upon informing the teacher that her mother is an actor and her father is a mathematics professor, the first British citizen of Afro-Caribbean descent to attend a British university, she is met with the patronizing assumption that she must be lying. Surely black people wouldn't have the emotional and intellectual intelligence to perform such high-powered jobs. Clark also develops eczema during her primary school years, leaving patches of lighter colored skin covering her face, and a newfound hope that, bit by bit, God is answering her prayers and making her white. In high school, the racist rot sets in even further. Clark develops a new habit for scratching her skin at night to the point of bleeding and bruising. Looking back at this experience, Clark theorizes that this was her body's way of expressing her extreme discomfort with being black. It gives us a picture of how horrific racism can truly be and the ways in which it forces minorities into believing that there's something wrong with them, instead of there being something wrong with the people hurling abuse in the first instance. It is this stage of her life when Clark deals with one of the most difficult parts of being a minority in a majority country. Through her interactions with teachers, friends, and boyfriends alike, she becomes deeply angry at those who abhor racism themselves, but seem unable to step in when racist events are actually occurring. Clark also deals with more nuanced experiences of racism, people who don't intend to be racist but end up making insensitive comments anyway. Whether intentional or not, these comments still hurt and are still part of the challenges of growing up black in a white country. Nonetheless, Clark continues to rise above the odds, becoming a prolific high school debater, maintaining her position at the top of the academic cohort, and forming a small but tight-knit group of friends who she can trust. Clark's recollection of her childhood ends on a relatively abrupt note, with Clark returning home to realize that her father has left the family for another woman. In a note to the family, he provides no explanation other than that he had a secret affair for many years. Suddenly, Clark, her brothers, sisters, and mother are left to pick up the pieces. In the epilogue, Clark is now an adult with a child of her own. Walking down Melbourne's North Road, she reflects on the challenges and opportunities to which her child will be witness. Clark portrays it as the dual sadness and happiness of knowing that in Australia, her children will surely have access to more opportunity than in most parts of the world, but it will come at a cost. Namely, they will also have to contend with the remaining undercurrent of racism that even now still seeps through Australian society. The unsatisfying end to the novel reflects the nature of racism and the experience of a minority growing up in a white country itself. There is no happy ending. Rather, life becomes a series of painful incidents interspersed with minor victories. Those who stand up against racism, those who fail to do so, and the hundreds of thousands of Australians who will forever grapple with a society that sees them as lesser than due to the colour of their skin. Alright, so now let's go to the second text pair, Charlie's Country. An Australian movie directed by Dutch-Australian Rolf de Heer, the film follows the story of Charlie, a First Nations man living in late 2000s Australia. The movie is set in the wake of 2007 Northern Territory intervention. As a bit of quick context, this was an action taken by the Commonwealth Government under Coalition Prime Minister John Howard to send Australian Defence Force troops into the Northern Territory. It came in response to the Little Children Are Sacred report, which raised allegations of child sexual abuse and neglect of children in Aboriginal communities. The intervention also involved restricting alcohol consumption, quarantining a portion of welfare payments to Indigenous residents, with the justification that this would prevent it being spent on alcohol, pornography, cigarettes, etc., and hefty fines as well as jail sentences for those who are forced to comply. It is important to note that throughout the whole intervention, not a single person was prosecuted for child sexual abuse or any related offence. Nonetheless, this intervention had real-world, drastic consequences. And that's exactly what Charlie's Country explores. At the time of De Heer's film, Charlie lives in a remote Indigenous community. Signs of the intervention are all around. Alcohol is banned from most communities. Many individuals face personal bans on procuring alcohol. Police officers dot the streets and citizens live under constant watch. Charlie, on a surface level, is a fairly happy-go-lucky individual. He exchanges jokes with police, is friendly with other elders and people in his community, and doesn't seem to do much else. As always with a movie like this, there's a bigger story behind this all. Rolf de Heer takes us through an increasingly concerning image of Aboriginal communities in the wake of the intervention. Charlie visits his local housing officer and is unable to obtain a house. Here, we see that Charlie is willing to work and wants stable accommodation, but the government is unwilling to provide. Going on a hunting trip with his friend, Black Pete, the two are stopped by police and their guns, as well as the water buffalo they killed, confiscated. Yet again, two Indigenous men try to provide for themselves, but are stopped by a legal system more concerned with rules and procedure than listening to First Nations communities themselves. Charlie decides he's had enough of having his every move and action monitored, and takes a stolen police car into the bush. Abandoning the car, he tries to leave amongst nature for an unidentified amount of time, cooking fish, performing traditional First Nation dances, painting on the bark and looking for shelter. Charlie finally appears to be home. Yet, as usual, it's too good to be true. The extreme cold makes Charlie incredibly sick, and before we know it, he wakes up in the Darwin hospital. After refusing further treatment from the white doctors who fail to understand Charlie's situation and why he's so angry at what's happened to him, the predictable cycle begins again. Charlie returns to his community, they all share alcohol as a way of coping with their current situation, and flee when the police come running to confiscate the liquor. Charlie isn't civil with the police this time. In a fit of anger, an outburst of emotion after decades upon decades of control and being denied access to any opportunity, he picks up a bat and smashes the police officer's car window. Brutally beaten into submission, Charlie is imprisoned as the police officer remarks that he should have never gone soft on a blackfella. Dragged before the courts, Charlie is imprisoned for assault. When the judge asks him to make a comment, he gives a lengthy speech in his native language. For De Heer, this acts as a symbolic assertion of the First Nations' rights to their own culture, and a proud statement against the many governments that have continually placed barriers in the way of Indigenous Australians having the same opportunities as any one of us. Eventually, Charlie is released on parole. He expresses a deep desire to go home, but also a sense of defeat. He resolves, in the end, to believe that even if he will always live under the watchful eyes of the Australian government, he can at least fight back and contribute by doing his bit to maintain the many cultures of our First Nations peoples. Charlie teaches young Indigenous boys traditional dances, speaking proudly of when he performed a dancing ceremony for Queen Elizabeth in 1973 at the Sydney Opera House. The movie ends with Charlie staring mournfully into the camera, almost looking into the audience themselves. There seems to be no happiness in his eyes, nothing left but a sense of sadness and resignation. I know that upon approaching the end of the film, I started to feel the same sadness that Charlie also inevitably shows us. It's a different type of emotion, one centered around the pain of knowing that we live in a country that still has not made peace with its past and refuses to listen to the First Nations people who know it best. Charlie's Country exposes us that Australia is a country where, even today, our First Nation citizens are not treated as equals. As such, Tahir's film is a stark reminder that this state of affairs is not good enough, and that the responsibility for change doesn't lie with politicians and decision makers. It's our job too, and failure is not an option. So now that you're familiar with the context and a summary of both the texts, let's move into the themes. Specifically, I'll use my convergent and divergent strategy to discuss these themes, because you'll need to be able to both compare the similarities and differences between the two texts in order to do really well in your SAC and exam. Now, if you aren't familiar with my convergent divergent strategy, then I recommend you go and have a watch at the video in order to fully understand it and then be able to actually execute it yourselves in your own essays. Connection to culture. Let's look at the converging ideas. Both Heer and Clark offer a unified idea around culture, that being connected to one's culture is inherently good and positive and should be encouraged. Let's break this down. The Hate Race and Charlie's Country are both works that explore the challenges of individuals maintaining their culture in surroundings that would otherwise see them revert to the standard. In this case, because we're talking about Australia, Tahir and Clark take us through the same story of overarching, implicit evidence that the Christian Anglo way of life is the norm. See here, by saying the same story, I'm converging both the themes and ideas and messages expressed by the authors. This standard has deep roots in the colonization of Australia and the resulting claim of sovereignty by the Crown. Even as this country has evolved into a multicultural land, it still bears the marks of a European country. Whether that be our British legal system, Anglo-American democracy, or any of the other institutions we've taken from the Western world. It is in this context that Tahir and Clark go to special lengths to explain why people should be empowered to connect to their culture. To our author and director, culture is an essential element of who you are. It is this identity that carries people through life. Again, here I'm converging the ideas together to express a point that both the author and director share, and this is how I use convergent divergent strategy throughout the essay in order to ensure that I tick off the Vika comparison criterion. So now we're moving into the divergent part of the convergent and divergent strategy. To explain this idea, let's first define and unpack intergenerational disadvantage. We could spend days talking about this, but simply, intergenerational disadvantage refers to the cycles of poverty and criminality that pass from generation to generation, worsening with time. When we apply this to Charlie's Country, the analogy becomes quite clear. Charlie lives in a community where there is no opportunity, because there is no jobs. Because there are no jobs and no real way to gain steady, meaningful employment, people fall into alcoholism, marijuana, and anything else to help them cope. Lung cancer and alcoholism shorten lifespans for people like the old man with failing kidneys, while no employer is going to waste a chance on those still living. There is simply no ability to succeed here, because the local residents don't see that there's anything worth working towards. Hopeless, unheard, and disillusioned, it becomes easier for Charlie's community to just accept their sorry lot in life than futilely work towards changing it. We aren't made to witness this same cycle in the Hate Race. Instead, Bordeaux Clark is the epitome of someone who has broken the cycle of intergenerational disadvantage, becoming the first individual in his community to attend a British university. Marrying a high-powered Guyanese actress in Cleopatra, the married couple represent success and a defiance of racist stereotype, not the grinding poverty and disadvantage we see in Charlie's Country. Although Maxine experiences terrible discrimination and prejudice as a child, there is always a sense that she will academically remain on top. Maxine uses the prejudice with which she's faced as a motivator, giving her the impetus to consistently emerge successful, whether that be in her schooling, cross-country running, as a debater, or any other academic endeavor. Sure, she faces racism that inhibits her from always succeeding. The Lions Club competition is a great example of such. But this isn't so much about intergenerational disadvantage as it is about racism, plain and simple. Ultimately, the difference between the two is a matter of emphasis. It's not that intergenerational disadvantage doesn't exist in the hate race, but more so that Clark is choosing to focus on how even the most successful individuals can suffer from prejudice and racism. This in turn helps us to understand that racism impacts everyone, and we should never pretend it isn't a massive problem. Conversely, Charlie's Country is all about social disadvantage and explores how prejudice can prevent oppressed individuals from becoming successful in the first place. So there you have it. I hope you found this explanation and analysis really helpful. If you did, you definitely want to check out our Hate, Race and Charlie's Country text guide. In this guide, which has been written by a 50 study scorer who was also awarded the English Premier's Award, you'll learn unique points of comparison through my convergent and divergent strategy, which is going to definitely help you stand out from the rest of the cohort. You also get a range of sample A+ essays, with every essay annotated and broken down on how and why these essays achieved A+, so you can see exactly how to replicate that in your own writing. You also get to peer into the mind of a 50 study scorer through advanced discussions like structural feature analysis, views and values, broken down into easy to understand concepts. There's also more background and thematic information about the text in there too, so you can be sure that we've covered everything you need to ace your response to the Hate, Race and Charlie's Country. If that's not convincing enough, you can even go and download a free sample of the study guide. The link is on the screen for you to check out. If you stayed all the way until the end of this video, thank you so much. I really appreciate you, and I'll be making a lot more videos to help you with your comparative assessment, so make sure that you are tuned in to this channel, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye!